Hello, my name is Tabea Hirzel, and this is a short presentation of my recent research thesis with the title Principles of Liberty, a design-based research on liberty as a priori constitutive principle of the social in the Swiss nation story. The following presentation is set up for those who have already read my dissertation. It would be further an advantage if you are also familiar with the core literature of the related bibliography. Otherwise, please go to presentation 001, Introduction. In the following, I will give a brief overview to remind the main points of this research and then directly present the application of the alternate reality game as narrative reenactment, starting from the givens, through the selection choices, over the story encoding and the story weaving towards the final storytelling process. The heart of this research was the idea that the ontology of the person relied on the Kantian transition gap, the logical gap between the empirical and the ideal, between body or matter and mind as nous. In short, between what is known, epistemology, and what becomes constituted in existence, ontology. It was assumed that the method to leap this gap was a genuine creative act, the adherence of meaning to objects, including one's own body. Thus, in a certain sense, the mind was a device oriented towards completeness, which as such did not exist in the real world. Incompleteness as a trigger for personal action could then also be used purposefully to motivate, direct, and manipulate the actions of others by designing them intentionally. This was the key mechanism of politically constitutional power. The creation of a nation's story served as model for such a constitutional process, which could be systematically reenacted in order to explore this phenomenon. Within the terminology of Phillips and Huntley's theory of story named Dramatica, the intentional design of gaps with the purpose to stimulate the direction of another's mind, the audience, was defined as propaganda. As already mentioned before, in order to function, propaganda required the ideal of completeness. Dramatica defined this by the presence of four perspectives, the four through lines, and the diligent encoding of all these perspectives throughout a story. These four through lines were overlapping with the four possible cardinal points in the different theories of social constitution analyzed in here: the I, you, we, and they perspectives in Alfred Schütz, Pedro Laín-Entralgo, and Viktor Frankl. Albert Schweitzer, in his Reverence for Life, offered a method for analyzing different societies according to their degree of being ethical, in which these cardinal points were described as simultaneous affirmation of the self, the other, the world, and the ideal. According to Schweitzer, the challenge was to orient one's actions towards the reverence of life. This implied that all the four cardinal points should be affirmed in the largest degree possible. The practical challenge of this, in contrast to the more commonly known golden mean or middle way, was that no trade-offs could be made to justify actions. It was equally bad to sacrifice the self for the other than to sacrifice the other for oneself. Nor was it acceptable to destroy the world for an ideal or to give up one's ideals in order to embrace the world. Obviously, this was a logically impossible position, a tetralemma, which could not be rationally solved, yet was performed in the everyday social world. Insisting on this orientation was called the tragic optimism. Schweitzer based his reverence for life on a conventional, representative, comparative methodology. In this research, true to the performative character of the phenomenon of social constituency, a non-representational, performative inquiry was suggested. For this purpose, Schweitzer's fourfold orientation was reenacted in a kind of alternate reality game. This methodology was strongly inspired by the traditional storytelling as political reenactment in the Yoruba society, firstly described in the academic context by Babalola Adeboye Ifatogun, and further made known by the Nigerian contemporary philosopher Akin Moses Makinde. Similar performative approaches were also found in Brazil's syncretic culture and the Congado, or in the ancient Australian Aboriginal tradition of the Alcheringa, also translated as the dreaming. I will concentrate in the following on the specific, admittedly unconventional application of the performative inquiry developed by the method of this study. The research process comprised a hermeneutic circle in 4 phases. First, the selection. Second, the preparation. Third, the coding. And fourth, the production of data. Each of the 4 research phases was approached in 4 ways, at 4 different levels of abstraction. 1. The conventional empirical. 2. The conjunctural critical. 3. The integrational manipulative. And 4. The categorical relational level. This represents the overall flow of data throughout the performance. Starting with the givens, I'll explain the game's main mechanism, Dramatica's propaganda. In line with other approaches in collaborative, self-guided learning methods, also known as community learning, the whole process started with a common problem. In this case, the focus lied on a universal problem, the becoming of the person as co-generative with the constitution of the community or society it belonged to. From this rather abstract problem, more concrete real-life issues emanated and were either implicitly or explicitly manifested. If they were implicit, it is rather uncautious, the process would start with the story first, probably an already existing story. In the other case, the process started with the definition of the problem, which had largely been developed in the theoretical part of this study. The problem of social constituency was reduced to the need of a specific task, a creative act, which could fulfill the impossible and leap the Kantian transition gap, also known as the noetic gap in Franklian psychology. This was the origin, or a priori, of the logical gap through which the effect of propaganda was created. According to Dramatica, it was signaled on the slides with a little yellow sun where it applied. The sample society for this research and its current problem was defined by the 19th century Swiss transition from the medieval caste system towards the modern democratic nation-state, as given through the current discourse in present Switzerland, its present controversial role as potential member of the European community, and its positioning under the threats of the global financial and geopolitical crisis. This was chosen only for exemplification of the gaming process. In a real alternate reality gaming, among the persons present here and now, we would probably choose a different population for our story. The key tool for data collection and data selection was the interactive database programmed in PHP MySQL for this research, named Spindle. It consisted mainly out of relational tables, through which data could be manipulated in a controlled way, and the process of manipulation and data maturity could be traced back to its original empirical source in every moment. This meant that the creative process was objectively monitored throughout the whole game. The Spindle offered the possibility to compare each step with external standards, as for example, international authority codes for names, bibliographic documents, places, and semantic units. For a better orientation, in the following, the relevant tables were signaled on the slide at the upper right corner. The collection method of the samples was a cohort sampling, which followed different sampling strategies according to the different levels of abstraction through the research phases. As such, the sample collection was never closed, but an ongoing, organic process which was part of the negotiation. First, historical characters which could later serve as characters in the story had to be selected and evaluated. Their purposeful selection was a well-known propaganda device in historiography. As such, the scientific method itself excluded fictional characters, as for example Wilhelm Tell. Further, the liberal movement in Switzerland had strategically eliminated the formerly well-known female personalities and hesitated to include workers, immigrants, and foreign voices. The object of exclusion was culturally bound, but that such exclusions existed was compulsive. Propaganda was intrinsic to history, due to the fact that it necessarily relied on incomplete data. The reason for this was that any data required a translation process in which they were transposed from their original context into the current context of the researcher or narrator and its audience. A large part of historical investigation could be automatized in order to enhance data stability. Yet, what was of major concern for this research was once data consistency was assured and purposeful distortion was excluded, there remained still a significant divergence among the possible interpretations of such original texts. This phenomenon was the well-known reason for hermeneutics. It was not the purpose here to discuss the credibility of a specific interpretation, but rather to make the interpretative process traceable and anchor it theoretically in order to enhance the scientific validation of the manipulative process. In other words, through linking a hermeneutic process with the bare data and to position it within the narrative or rhetorical structure, it was assumed to become easier detected and compared. For the theoretical grounding, Goffman's frame analysis, especially impression management in combination with the Franklian categories of the tragic problem, was proposed. In the example on the slide, I wondered why Weiss emphasized his participation as member of the Cantonal Council, even though he was also war counsel by this time and leader of the Young City Guard. I considered that he might have desired to give authority to his speech and the justification of his participation in the conflict, while de-emphasizing the aggressive character of his role as military leader. Certainly, another player, any of you, might interpret this in a different way. Once agreement on the best, the most credible interpretation of the data was found, they had to be contextualized into a new story, the one written by us. This was done by translating the self-expression from the autobiographical texts by objectifying them into a third-person perspective as character scenes and to combine it with another's autobiographical text into the so-called encounter scenes, the actual scenes of our story. On this slide, an example was given combining Weiss' experience at the climax of the 1839 putsch in Zurich with that one of Hirzel from the opposing party, a classical approach in historiography known from many battle reports. It should be observed here that the choice of the climax itself, the moments of significant encounters, was already a manipulative act. Finally, the aim of any storytelling was the creation of logical and aesthetic unity out of incomplete information, forming character scenes. In contrast, the aim of empirics was to associate data with material science, artifacts or texts in the largest sense, independent of their meaning or completeness. As such, historiography as a discipline leaped not only the gap between science and creative writing, but foremost between the material, factual and the always fictional ideal of theory. Up to a certain degree, this approach, intrinsic to all scientific representation, became problematic in history due to its characteristics as time-transcendent message, which had the power to create a vision of the future through the interpretation or reinterpretation of the givens of the past. As learned from Mackinder, there lied an intrinsic political force in history writing. Thus, for the cautious manipulation of this political engagement, the software Dramatica Pro, designed by the authors of the Dramatica theory, Phillips and Huntley, was suggested. It was developed as a tool for a self-guided creative writing process, and it was integrated into the spindle in order to ground the creative process of storytelling and story writing on the historical data sources. In first place, the characters had to be developed and arranged in relation to each other. The meaning of a story changed significantly, not only according to the character selection, but also due to their roles and relationships. As such, I proposed Katharina Morel as the protagonist. You can see her here as main character in the framework of the 4 through lines described by Dramatica. In turn, the Swiss historian Thomas Meyssen's favorite character, as main character and protagonist, was probably Alfred Escher. At least, this could be derived from several of his historiographic writings and his contribution to the most recent filmic version of Swiss history, Die Schweizer, the Swiss. Further, the different phases in the character development were thematically encoded. Even if you would choose the same characters as I, you might probably want to challenge some of my thematic allocation. This would further have consequences on the dynamic structure of the story. From a scientific perspective, the assignation of themes to historical characters was probably the most subjective step in the whole process, which became traceable and comparable through the spindle. In order to test a nation's story against the universal of Schweizer's ethics, the attitude of tragic optimism had to be present in Dramatica. This was found in its story dynamics. On the one side, it was reflected in the encoding of the story as actual dilemma, combining a successful outcome with the demand of a personal transformation or change for the main character, and its evaluation as good. If this narrative orientation, defined as ethical, was also reflected in a society's daily life, could now be tested by a larger comparative research. What became directly visible through this structural approach to stories was the interdependence between the situation and the individual action in a Goffmanian sense, on which could be played deliberately. The political potential of stories had already been mentioned in here, and it was diligently applied since ancestral times. In some cases, it was even integrated into a modern constitution, as in the example of the present dual constitution of Ghana. In a similar way, historiography as scientific discipline could be understood as such an intent of integration in Western cultures. In this context, the relevant characteristics of stories was not so much the fact that they are told, but that they are retold. In a last step, story scenes had to be sequenced into a storyline. Rather than subjective, this was a culturally dependent process, mainly depending on the culture's time perception. A classical chronological sequencing was not less propaganda than on any other, due to the fact that temporal coincidences and sequences could give an impression of causal relationships where they did not necessarily apply. Remember, at the center of the theoretical approach lied the ontological turn. Applied to Hoppe's argumentation ethics, this had far-reaching consequences. Whereas for Hoppe, discursiveness was merely a tool for the validation of epistemological knowledge and rules, in here the person was defined and actualized ontologically by the discursive relation to other persons. Due to this ontological turn, the isolated individual could no longer be upheld, for the person was not only a time and space transcendent phenomenon, but also a subject transcendent entity, and as such co-emergent with the phenomenon of society. The assumed constitutional universal was that the person and society emerged from liberty as pure potentiality or acting. Liberty being the a priori, not a value. This concluded in probably the most relevant implication for political science. As already learned from Christie, conflicts were not simply a problem that needed to be solved, but a source for the further perpetuation or development of the person's becoming. By negotiating our common story, it was possible to enter into a manifold, peaceful, but agonistic author-audience relationship in which our own being could be affirmed and actualized without the threat to annihilate the other. Two examples for such a process of resilience were the recent project of Ali Abu Awad and Hanan Schlesinger at the Palestinian Institute of Nonviolence. Another was Benjamin Giraud's efforts to promote the Swiss reconciliation with Amish and Mennonites in collaboration with Parson Gary Keller. Following through the intersubjective character of storytelling and the redefinition of past conflicts as a result of objectification of the past, transcending its meaning into a future dimension. Now, could you detect the hidden propaganda as awareness in my text? Right. It was the idea that Switzerland could serve as a model at all. As an aesthetical resume of this almost mystical process in which the mind becomes manifest in existence as body, I proposed Leonard Cohen's mantra, God is alive, magic is afoot. I hope you enjoyed this, and many thanks for listening.